I was scared a little bit, if I'm honest. It was brutal, and the company nearly went under a couple of times, and thousands of people would have lost their jobs, and he was as calm as a cucumber. But I actually said to him one day late at a board dinner, I said, Tom, you've been really successful. Would you change anything with the benefit of hindsight? He said, yeah, I absolutely would. So I thought, what is it? He said, I wish I'd spent more time smelling the flowers.
Welcome to the Mindflick podcast. The Mindflick podcast explores the psychology of high performance. Every episode, we will sit down with leaders, athletes, and change makers to uncover the turning points, the pressure moments, and the crucial experiences that define their journey. I'm Sir Andrew Strauss, chairman of Mindflick.
And I'm Pete Lindsay, performance psychologist and co-founder at Mindflick. And we'll be taking you inside the mindset shifts that have shaped some of the best minds in both sport and business. And we'll blend that thought leadership with real life stories, bringing performance psychology to life in a way that's practical, human, and impactful.
Okay, well, joining us on today's podcast is Phil Jansen, just one of these brilliant people that has incredible energy and enthusiasm for life. Very much a corporate titan, having done huge CEO jobs at WorldPay, BT, and currently the chair of WPP. Unbelievably driven, I think that comes across in the podcast as well, but also manages to make it all look so easy, including on the golf course where he's annoyingly good and keeps beating me. So what did you think of the episode, Pete?
Yeah, exactly that. A fascinating journey through his career, the high profile roles, the success he's enjoyed, but also that human side. So he talks quite often about the need to slow down, in order to speed up, to take those moments, to enjoy the journey, to smell the flowers, as well as succeed and strive, but also a story of adapting and shifting his style as the moment needed it. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating podcast.
We hope you enjoy. Well, Phil, a great welcome to the Mindflick podcast. I have to say, I count myself very lucky to have encountered you in various different guises over the years, sometimes in business, sometimes in sport, sometimes on the golf course. And I've always greatly admired your extraordinary energy and enthusiasm. Even running big businesses, you've always had this sort of boyish optimism. And so it's a great pleasure to have you on the podcast. A very warm welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
As you know, this podcast is all about these turning points, these big moments in our lives where maybe we change our perspective on the world, that we see ourselves and others around us differently. We always kick off the podcast just by asking, Phil, what are you best known for and what are you doing with yourself now?
Well, probably best known as the ex-CEO of BT, and I'm the non-exec chair of WPP.
A man with big jobs. He's clearly continuing to do big jobs, and really interested to kind of get into how you got into those big roles and also kind of what drives you, the sort of mindset that drives you, etc. So let's kick off then. This first turning point, we've had a conversation before the podcast kicked off, and you talked a little bit about Procter Gamble, that being a big turning point in your life. So do you want to kick off with that?
Yeah, it was. I think from a relatively young age, I don't know why, but I always knew I wanted to be involved in business and probably leading business activity. Never set out ever to sort of be a CEO, by the way, but P&G was the first job I had after university, and I looked at sort of three different things that I could have done, and I was lucky enough to have these three offers, and I chose P&G, and with the benefit of hindsight, I'm absolutely delighted I did, because it really was a key turning point for me, because I learned so much. I was probably there for 5 years, worked across different functions, mainly sales and marketing. The last thing I did there was the brand manager of Pantene shampoo.
Nice.
Which I left because my hair started falling out. You would have left Strauss as well. But I think the reason it's such a turning point was it's a spectacularly good company for investing in young talent and giving them the tools to be successful as a business leader. They provided a few very, very important lessons to me early on around the importance of strategic thinking and working out what was really important. So there's this sort of sense of prioritization and focusing on objectives, making tough choices, which is ultimately what strategy is all about, but also very much focusing on the importance of people and teams and collaborating, and then also elements of behavior, how to behave in environments with other people, teams and larger organizations, and the importance of integrity and those kind of things were instilled in me from an early point of view. And I still to this day use many of the frameworks And so I look at that as a major turning point. And I guess the other thing they had was a very, very strong performance culture. You had to be going up or you were out, but they were very careful how they managed that process. Very professional, very polite, very fair, and very objective. But if you weren't performing at a high standard, you were leaving the organization. The other thing they did was to give young graduates massive responsibility very early, but also have a sense of accountability as well. So if you have that responsibility, you have to take accountability for delivering outcomes. It gave me the chance to understand some of the tools to be successful in large, complicated organizations where you had some degree of authority, but not complete authority, because you never do. Even when you're the ultimate boss, you've still got to work through people. So that's probably why that's the first turning point for me.
Interested to focus on that leadership bit. You said right at the start, I always was interested in sort of leading teams. Like, was that something that came naturally to you through your sort of junior years, where you always looked upon as the sort of captain of the team or whatever, or was it something that kind of got thrust on you over time?
No, I was, in a leadership position at school, at university, captain various teams. I started off, I guess, being a leader when I was younger, maybe because I scored more goals than anybody else. And I learned, when other people got better than me and I was still the captain, it's a very different thing when you're, one of the less good players in the team, but you're still the captain. And that very much happened to me quite a few times through my sporting junior career. So I suppose I like the idea of how to lead a team and get the best out of people, to try and really understand how they think, how they feel, why they think and feel those things. You want difference and you want diversity, but to make sure that everyone has this common aim and feels good about the common aim and their role in it. And that's a complicated, obviously, set of dynamics in any team, whether it's a sporting team or a business team or a large group of senior managers. How one constructs the team and how one gets alignment on the objective and manages conflict, which I don't see as a bad thing. I think it's a good thing as long as it's handled well and there's a formula for dealing with it. So I've always enjoyed that stuff. And so I think I probably had a little bit of an insight to it through school and university, but again, it's a different thing in business. And so I was thrust into it, as I say, with good fortune at P&G. Things went quite well there and I had great people, actually. Again, that was another key part about my P&G experiences. And if you've got very, very good people, you've got a real chance. And if you don't, you haven't. So recruitment of people is such an important thing, and constructing a team is such an important thing. And I think P&G, again, that laid the foundation for that. And I would say over my career, my leadership approach and style has continued to evolve and change, and I've learned so much. I'm still learning now how to do it, and I really enjoy that process of thinking through how to lead.
Often when you put into a leadership role early in life, like in a sports team, and someone sees a spark in you, right? And they kind of recognize that spark. They want you to kind of bring that spark to the team. Then the P&G example, where you're saying actually that spark then got some structure kind of behind it, and the two things kind of meet. What was the structure that you gained?
So what P&G did really well was that they gave you sort of a set of objective criteria that made good leaders and good managers. And so you were able to assess people objectively and also have a set of criteria that we could hold each other accountable for, and behaviors. So I think that's the difference, I think. And I think some of those things will make them their way into other areas of life. Things like, working effectively with others, setting targets, creating alliances, understanding people's weaknesses, showing integrity, doing the right thing when people aren't watching. There's a lot of judgment involved in leading anything. But if you can sort of get some facts and some objective assessments on things, it really helps make those judgments more likely to turn out the right way. P&G would be in everything, a very evidence-based business, including people assessment. So both on the recruitment, but also how you're doing and why you're doing well and where you could do better. And I think the other big learning point about P&G was, which I've really believed, is getting better never stops, and continuing to strive for innovating and improving and doing better is a really important way of approaching life and commercial activities, and never, ever allow complacency or entitlement to sneak in. And those things do happen when there's success. So having a framework or a set of principles or set of criteria just gives you that ability just to have some science and fact to what is sometimes very instinctive.
And does that objective analysis, does that kind of play a role in their moderating? Because I guess, you want to bring competitiveness, you want people to drive, to push, to not let the success kind of begin the slide that can happen after success quite often. But you've got the competitiveness on the one hand, and you've got the strong people focus on the other, and they're not mutually exclusive. The two things can sit together, but sometimes there's a tension there within teams, within organizations.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a great point. And, this, again, the fun of it is, from a company point of view, you are competing with your competitors in the market, and you're ultimately trying to sell either more products or services and delight customers better than the other guys. That's simple. But actually, in the pursuit of that, you've got a group of people, and it'll be a team of somewhere between 10 and 15 typically, who are in the pursuit of executing that. But within that team, there's competition. That can be either very unhealthy or extremely healthy or anywhere in between. So the skill of the leader is to capitalize on that dynamic in a healthy way, making sure that you are encouraging people to perform and have a degree of competition where it's appropriate, but not for that ever to be out of kilter with the overall aim, and also not causing damage in the team. It's a very delicate balance. And so, I've got lots of examples in my career where I've had super successful people who would be the equivalent of a massive goal scorer who you can't do without, but their behaviors have been sometimes completely out of control. Managing that is really, really important. And the way I would typically do that is try and explain to those people to moderate their behaviors sometime, in that they wouldn't be scoring goals unless there was someone who's passing the ball to them, because you can't play by yourself. So I've really enjoyed managing that dynamic and encouraging people to outcompete our competition and make sure we've got a common, it's not an enemy in a war sense, but it's useful to think of it in that sort of analogy, but focus on the people we're trying to be outside the company and moderate your behavior a little bit internally, because ultimately we're all on the same side. And I know that maybe you all want my job, but only one of you can get it, and let's behave properly, and there's be a process for that at some stage.
That resonates so strongly with me. Just the cricketing correlation to that, really. Like, one of the things we talk about a lot at Mindflick is that teams are inherently dysfunctional for that very reason. You are competing against each other. You've all got your own agendas and motivations, etc., etc. And that's why the value of a strong team environment is so crucial, because it takes people's focus away from what they want to what the team needs. But those cultures don't just exist. That's why you have to work hard on this stuff. And that is the crux of good leadership, isn't it?
It is, but and I'll tell you the way I've handled it, and there's lots of different ways to be successful. I think that, having said that, one of the ways that helps manage that dynamic, Strauss, is you want people who are hugely ambitious for themselves. That's a good thing. The thing is, if the organization has a massive ambition that can fuel that will insulate you against a situation where people's personal ambition begins to outweigh the group ambition. So you need this common aim, this objective, this ambition that people are willing to slightly moderate their own personal ambition for the greater good. Sometimes in business, economics can do that. So when you have a management team and they realize that actually, particularly at certain points in their career, that there are some commercial, financial benefits for them in behaving a certain way, they're willing to give up and say, well, maybe I won't take a bit more responsibility and let someone else do it who's better than me, because it will help us achieve our overall aim. So it's one of the things that business has, is it can align incentives, which I'm a great believer in, but it has to be done appropriately and fairly for all stakeholders. So I'm a big fan of massive ambition. And I really believe in if you as the leader don't start with a massive ambition, no one else will. So I've always done that. I've always started with huge ambition, and people always say, well, I'm right with you. I'm right with you. That's the way to go. But their conviction probably isn't necessarily the same as yours. So I would give you an example. I remember one time I had a group of people, probably a bit later in my career, came up with this target. And I said, I think we should get to this size, this revenue, this profitability. And everyone, the whole team, 12 of them went, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So would you do me a favor? Could you now write down your contribution of that X 100 million, what it is? And so let's just say the number was, well, I want to get to 300 million. They wrote the number out, handed it in to me. I looked at it, 100 million. So they're all up for the 300 million. When I asked them for their part of it, it didn't get to a third of it. So what I did was I had made sure they were sitting in the right seats. I'd written on an envelope, strapped under their seat, what I thought their contribution should be. So it was a way for me to say, we all wanted this 300 million, but actually you think it's only 100. So under what circumstances could we get to 300? Because you have to do 3 times on average what you thought you were going to have to do. And some of them weren't, it wasn't exact, obviously. So that's a great example where trying to make sure that people believe and are convinced of and want to engage in the larger ambition, the greater goal, will help people behave in a way which is aligned with that and insulate you a little bit from personal aims. That's where, as a leader, I think you be very considerate of people's individual agendas and aims and objectives. And I think that's part of the job, is spending the time to understand your people in the team and helping them navigate their own personal aspirations and make the best for themselves and bring it back to that common aim. To finish the point, although I might be the guy who would start it, I would never allow it to be Phil's ambition. Can't be. It's got to be our ambition. And that means co-creating. It's much bigger than a financial target. That is the outcome. I did it to make the point, but the thing wasn't about the financials. It was, what kind of company do we want to be?
Yeah.
What do we want to do for customers? What are we trying to create?
Yeah, it's a really interesting. You answered a very important question in my head that keeps coming back to me. In sport, it's so easy to set the ambition, right?
Yeah.
You want to be number one in the world. You want to be the best team ever. You want to win this number of games or whatever. I always think that's a more difficult conversation to have in the corporate world. But you've actually answered it by going, you've got to be really clear what sort of business you're going to be, or you have aspirations to be, and then what does that look like in terms of outcomes as well? So, you know, a lot of people find it hard to articulate that. So that's amazing.
Sorry, I think it's easier in business than it is in sport.
Oh, really?
Maybe it's easier to say, here's the target, I want to win that. But it's much more binary in sport. In business, you can say, I want to be a business that does this. There's much more wiggle room on what success looks like. If it's, I want to win the World Cup, I want to win the Ashes, you did or you didn't. I want to be a company that provides that. I mean, it's how you define those things. So there is a bit of wiggle room on success and failure. It's not binary if you make it non-financial.
Sure, understood. I suppose in sport, for me, you set that ambition, we want to do X, and then you've got to bring to life, well, what sort of performance levels do we need to attain to get there? So it's a similar sort of process.
Absolutely the same. Absolutely the same.
We've got off to a very strong start there, but we're going to head now to your second turning point, which you talked about. It's obviously a more personal side to your story.
Yeah, I think for me, if I look back on my life, I'm 58 now, my family situation has been hugely important to me. You know, I've been lucky enough to come from a very strong family, a very loving family. I've got 2 great brothers. I've got a brilliant wife. I've got 5 wonderful kids. But like anybody, you know, you have ups and downs. But the downs often shape you as well, both in business and a family environment. So I think I benefit from having these strong bonds and such a strong family. But I've also, you know, suffered some difficult situations. My father passing away when he was very young. I was like 29. Sheila's, my wife's father, breaking his neck playing rugby and was a quadriplegic. Age 50, those things have shaped the way I see, I think, what's important. And so whilst I've loved my job, it's been hugely important to me, everything I've done and all the jobs I've had the privilege to do, but it's not been the only thing that I've thought about. But if you've got high standards and high expectations, which I have, I want to do the job extremely well. I don't want to ever feel I didn't do 100% of what I could to make it successful. Because if you do that, you'll feel satisfied. And all you can do in the end is do your best. The relevance of the point, though, is just prioritizing my family and my friends enough so I don't feel I'm neglecting them. I never did that. And they give me a great strength, I think, that says, yes, it's important, but it's only a job.
How do you keep that though, Phil? Because like in sport, as an example, if there's a moment in an athlete's life, you know, in their personal life that is, you know, a key kind of crucible, life-changing moment, it often for a period of time gives them a sense of perspective on sport, and they play much more freely, they don't worry as much and so on. But what you see is over time, that perspective does tend to wane, actually, and the anxieties can creep back in, the tension can creep back in. But you're describing it there, having that home base, having those moments, those key moments give you an ongoing sense of perspective.
Yes, it really has done. I think when you've experienced setbacks as I've described, that has endured and given me a perspective of what's really important. When I was on the board of My Travel, we had on the board a chap called Sir Tom Farmer. He was the founder of QuickFit, hugely successful. And we were going through a mega crisis, and it was pressure. And I was, again, very young for the job I was doing. I was scared a little bit, if I'm honest. It was brutal, and the company nearly went under a couple of times, and thousands of people would have lost their jobs, and it was very problematic. And he was as calm as a cucumber. But I actually said to him one day late at a board dinner, I said, Tom, you've been really successful. Would you change anything with the benefit of hindsight? He said, yeah, I absolutely would. So I said, oh, what is it? He said, I wish I'd spent more time smelling the flowers. And when he said it, I knew what he meant, but I then followed it up and said, just what do you mean by that? And of course, he'd come from absolutely nothing, from nowhere, and had built this business from nothing. It was his whole life. And he had neglected some of the things that I just referred to from a family point of view. And he regretted it. And he was kind enough to tell me that and be honest with me. And I made a mental note, literally then, that is not going to be me. I am not going to be in that situation. I'm in my 70s, hopefully, where I feel that, because he's done me a massive favor, and he meant it in a nice way. So it's about keeping perspective. At the same time, I've always tried to maintain a healthy lifestyle, do my exercise and stuff. When you're working flat out, traveling all over the place, it's hard. And I remember thinking at about the same time, actually, I'll get to, I'll do next year, things will be a bit better, it'll be a bit calmer. And I realized, no, it's never going to be like that. So I made the decision, early 30s, I am going to go to the gym regularly because it's good for me physically, but I realize it's good for me mentally. And I am going to make time to smell the flowers where I can, and be conscious about the compromises and the sacrifices that I'm making, and be cool about it. These jobs can be stressful, right? Any leadership job, don't care what it is, if you take it seriously, which most people do, 99% of people, and there's the odd exception who are, egotistical maniacs, but most people I know who lead big companies are dedicated, good people who take it seriously and will feel the stress of a job and the pressure to perform and deliver, and the responsibility of a big organization where you have 100,000 people, in my case at BT, who are relying on you to do a good job. So you need to do a good job. What you cannot do, I don't think, is feel like you haven't put everything in.
I remember Darren Lehman, the cricketer, once saying that the key to playing well in cricket at the top level is to play like it doesn't matter at all, even though it's all that matters. And the only way you can get into that mindset is if you don't define your self-worth by how many runs you get that day. You've got to have something bigger in your life that you judge yourself against. And that's everything you've talked about there. Your work is incredibly important. You're running big businesses, a lot of people relying on you, but the pressure comes off when you realize there's actually more to your life than just that.
100%. There's more to life than just that. And something, the other thing is, failure is part of life. No one is successful all the time in all scenarios. It's not possible. So get used to failure and embrace it. Of course, you can't keep failing, because then you don't get selected or you get fired. That's the way of it. But the sort of adjacency to that point, Strauss, is if you've done everything you possibly can, whether it's, in your case, it's practicing, training, everything you possibly can. In our case, it's preparing, analyzing, thinking carefully. You've done everything you possibly can, and it hasn't worked out. It hasn't worked out. Don't worry about it. So I've always believed in that. You get the best people, you fling everything at it, and if it doesn't work out, learn from it, move on. People always go, yeah, we could do that, but they don't want to fail. But you are going to fail. I've always had this phrase with people, these once I've made a terrible mistake, and I said, before you start, I can tell you right now, don't worry about it, as long as you don't do it again. Don't make the same mistake twice. And I think people have appreciated that, and that helps them think about risk profiles and what to do.
What I liked about the quote from Sir Tom Farmer, that idea of like taking the time to smell the flowers as well, is that for a long career, to succeed in that long career, it's often the moment of pause, of either reflection or rest, family time, that kind of thing. It's the pauses that power you. Ultimately, they're the things that allow us to sustain that level of performance over a long term. If it's just full throttle, 10 out of 10 every single day, often that's not sustainable. So there's a little bit around looking after yourself, staying healthy, eating well, having a settled home life. All those things play a part in long-term success.
100% again. Honestly, I've seen people make the mistake of not being able to do that, if that makes sense, and burning out and crashing and having, whether physical or mental breakdown, because again, in an organization, and I'm sure it's similar in sport, there's, if you're the leader, there are many decisions you're taking all the time, but they're not all equally important. And the trick is to make sure that you get more of the really important decisions right. And so people often say to me, oh, what are you looking for in a leader? And they always say, we look for decisiveness. And I said, yeah, that's great. Of course we need that. but you can be decisive and made a load of bad decisions. How do you go about making decisions is what I'm interested in. When I'm interviewing people, I want to tell me how you think. How do you assess things? How do you assess risk? What's your formula for doing those things? And how can you, to your point, make sure that over time you can maintain that performance? And I think it's hard to do that without that sort of broader perspective and a bit of space and a bit of time and a bit of calmness and peaceful assessment of where you are and what's happening. And very importantly, using other people to give you perspectives on you and how they see what's happening. And so as a leader, listening is such an underrated exercise, because you will decide. You're the leader, so you might as well take all the advice you possibly can. Because in the end, you're going to decide and you're going to be accountable for the decision. You hear things, but also you assess things through judgment and people's body language and how convincing they are. And you spot patterns. The ability of people to lead teams, but also to spot things that other people can't see quickly is hugely important.
Viktor Frankl spoke about a gap between stimulus and response, and all the power in the world sitting in that gap, like choosing my response. And that difference between being reflective and taking our time and using that gap versus reflexive. I'm just going to straight away kind of respond to it's a reflex action. There's a discipline to that, particularly, we were looking at your profile before we began today, right? There's a discipline to that. If our natural tendency is fast-paced, ticking clock in the back of our head, let's move things forward, let's drive things. The discipline sometimes to slow down, to make make those really important decisions well, to let us speed up in the long run.
I would be very deliberate on that. It goes back to the sort of saying and demonstrating. So I would be keen to make decisions quickly where we can. It's very possible we could be whizzing through things and people go, my goodness, yes, do that, don't do that, do this. And then suddenly we slow down. And the reason we're slowing down is either it's hugely important or we're not so sure, or I'm not so sure. So having the ability to work out which ones go fast. Sometimes, by the way, I've watched things happen which I totally disagree with, but I've assessed it. There's momentum here. I wouldn't do that. There are big decisions, and I said that earlier, you've got to make sure that the CEO, the leader, you're all over those. But in a big organization, the things happening all the time. So sometimes, even if the odd thing doesn't look right to you, let it go. Let it go. Don't fight everything. You're not right on everything, because you're only based on what you're seeing. And the more you get into other people's world, the more dangerous it is. So I've learned over time to know when to demonstrate speed, when to slow down, and also when to just let things go. And that's a skill that I encourage people to develop and actually have fun trying to work out when you're in which category.
It's interesting. One of my reflections, both with the work I did as in the England cricket team and then afterwards sort of running elite cricket, was making the right decision is often not as important as you think it is. It's far more important just to commit to the decision you make, and then often you have the right results as a result of that. If you make the right decision but don't commit, then you often won't have the right result. It takes quite a lot of pressure off if you look at it through that guise, really, which is decisions do need to be made. Often you don't have complete information. Sometimes it's just about getting that information, making the decision and committing to it.
Agree. And again, I think I can look back and I can see many, many times where we've been drifting a bit, not sure. And I've taken exactly that approach, which is we need to decide here. And we're now in a position where we've got a couple of options, and it's unlikely one is dramatically better than the other. But if we don't do one and do it really well, we're going to go backwards. And the trick is to say, we're going down this path and it will be successful if we all execute it, and it will be, but if we don't, it won't. So I think this right, are we all in on this? And so making sure people are aligned, even if it's either suboptimal or you're uncertain, is a really important thing in a company. My model for that is almost that visual decision tree that we all know about, and working out where are you on that decision tree. And if you're at the beginning of it, focus hard, because if you get one wrong there, it doesn't matter how good the decisions are, 3 sequences down the line, it's a function of the first one. So that's what, again, as a leader at the top of a company, it's the bigger decisions that set the path. And that's my point, of when you're 5 sort of layers away, don't stress about the detail of that. You're better off charging at something and getting it done really well. I've seen that work many times and surprised myself sometimes that actually that worked out better than I thought, because a decision was better than no decision. But there are times when we'd say time is your friend, wait either for more information or just let things roll a little bit and let other people do something first.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Sometimes we will say as a team and say, look, hang on, time's our friend here. It may look indecisive. Let's just wait. Let's come back in 2 weeks' time and see where we are. And that works really well in negotiations, by the way. Again, I've been lucky enough to be involved in many huge negotiations. It's great fun. It's not a game, but it is a game. So if you treat it as a game, you do your very best here. You don't have to win every point. So the question is, what's the aim? What's the ambition? What you're trying to achieve? And if you're clear about that, you can then play the game in a way that actually is most likely to get the outcome, and deliberately lose things and be deliberate about when you decide to say certain things, do certain things. It's a discipline that I guess I've learned over time.
Hi there. Hope you're enjoying the episode. We know people power performance. When you unlock their potential, everything changes. That's why we built Mindflick, a SaaS solution where performance psychology meets innovative technology. Trusted by the best in sport and business, Mindflick transforms self-awareness into high-impact performance. We give you the tools to move from insight to action, creating results you can measure. If you're ready to elevate your leaders, empower your teams, and fuel your organization's growth, find out more at mindflick.co.uk and start your journey today. Now, back to the episode.
You talked previously about, obviously, the important people in your life and those life experiences that made a big difference to you. I think your next turning point, you talked a little bit about really the people you've encountered and worked with. So the figures in your work environment that have had the greatest effect on you.
For me, personally, who you work for and who you work with is absolutely critical. And I never thought about it in that way on my way through my working life. But with the benefit of hindsight, I was pretty ruthless about that. And I only went to places where I felt the people were absolutely brilliant and really nice. So I would just urge people, don't go to places where there aren't people you really like and rate. My own experiences, I have, people who took huge gambles with me and gave me massive responsibility, whether it be a David Jacobs at Dunlop Slasengjo, who gave me a massive job way before I was probably qualified. And so without him, I may not have been the CEO of other companies. And then equally, when I made a big switch to the private equity world, the Dwight Pollers and the Robin Marshalls and the James Brocklebank, these people who were running these big private equity firms, they backed me and took a risk on me, but I made the judgment of them. Sometimes when you're going through the recruitment process and you're thinking of joining other places, you're desperate to get the job, and then you get off the job, you take it. I would just put a little word of caution. Even if the job sounds great, I think the people matter more than we realize, because they are the route to opportunity. And I don't just mean for you personally, but if they are good people, both from a capability point of view, but also from an integrity and sort of individual point of view, it's more likely good things will happen. I just think a turning point for me is I've been lucky enough to work for, work around brilliant people, and I feel blessed by that experience.
So often, it's a combination of people seeing something in you that maybe you haven't seen yet, and you almost borrow their belief a little bit. And then the flip side of leadership roles can be lonely roles. You don't always get a lot of feedback as a leader, and then having someone who will still speak the truth to you and say, actually, this piece, you need to work on this piece.
No, it's right. And a lot of those people were so experienced, they knew how to give feedback. I was always somebody who's very keen to take feedback. We had this sort of way of operating, which was, let's just be direct and honest. You don't need to beat around the bush on performance or on style or feedback. Let's just hear it and discuss it. We had some brilliant board meetings in different places, but WorldPay as an example, one particular occasion where the CEO, me, was assessed by all staff, which I think was a great thing. I was seen as coming across as not caring, for example, right? Which was very upsetting to me when I felt I was extremely caring, but that's obviously not the way that people saw me, right? So I knew I cared, but the scores were so low, I was completely confused. And I almost changed what I did dramatically as a result of it in terms of in the company. And it's actually Martin Skukluna, who's the chairman of Sainsbury's, said to me, under no circumstance should you change what you're doing. You are changing this company so dramatically and for the good. Don't change what you're doing. Think about how you were doing certain things as to why people are and it's sort of obvious, but often when you get feedback, you take it personally and you start to get a bit defensive and try and explain to yourself why that's not the case. It is the case. So why is it the case? And as the leader, it's your responsibility. I mean, you can decide you don't want to change it, but if you want to change it, then you have to think about how you might do that. And so that's where I've had the benefit of people helping me keep changing and learning and developing my leadership style and being able to adapt.
One more question on this one, because you talked about how important it was to work for great people. There'll be a lot of people out there that will go, well, when I applied for a job, I had the interview and the person seemed like a great person in the interview, but it was only by working with them for a long period of time I realized all their flaws and they weren't what they were pretending to be. I mean, do you feel like you got a very good intuition on this, or is there any advice you'd give to people around how you approach these opportunities that come your way in terms of judging people?
Very good question. I think, and I hope I'm a reasonably good instinctive judge of those things. But like all of us, you make errors, and probably on an instinctive basis, people tend to go too quickly. I will watch myself go down a particular path and pull myself back and say, well, let's just hang on a minute. Let's just think through the other route. This is how I felt and how I think, but have I read things correctly? So there's an exercise that just controls the instinctive bias to find things that reinforce your initial thought. And what happens is you often ignore the things that are going against it and you look for more evidence. We all do it.
That's so true.
So you've got to fight it. And I physically fight it in lots of ways, not just through the recruitment process, but this is relevant to this question. On a different track, I dispassionately look and ask questions about certain things to give evidence that my judgment is correct or my instinct is right. When I joined Bain Capital as one of their companies, as CEO of Brakes, I was moving from a much bigger company, as reduced responsibility, and it wasn't something I was sure about. And Dwight was the person who was recruiting me. And in the end, I said to him, I can't do it, Dwight. And I really liked him. He was a brilliant guy. I trusted him. And he said, why not? And I gave him 6 reasons. And by the way, only one was financial. And I'd met him many times, but this was on the phone. And in the moment, he said, don't worry, they're all fine. There's no negotiation. Just straight away, in the moment, I knew I was joining him. And what he said to me, by the way, I'll tell you exactly what he said to me, is if you join as CEO of Brakes and you do a good job, you're in our family, you will end up being a CEO of another one of our portfolio companies. And that's how I got the job as CEO of WellPay. It wasn't planned, but I took a risk. But it was based on my judgment of him and the evidence in that moment. What a guy. When he said, just straight away, you can have all 6, I joined. And he was good to it's not his word, it was good to his principle. And we never talked about it again.
Brilliant. Well, the mention of WellPay takes us nicely on to your next turning point, which was an experience you had as CEO of WellPay.
For me, it was such a turning point because I was thrust into the CEO job working with a great partner, Ron Khalifa, who was there at the start of the deal, who was like the deputy chair, full-time exec with me. And we just had an amazing experience running that company in a crazy time where it grew very, very rapidly. Everyone sees it as a huge success, which it was. Of course it was. But it wasn't easy and it didn't look like it was going to be successful. Sometimes there were many moments when it was highly pressured, very difficult. The IT expenditure for us was hundreds of millions more than anticipated. And in any environment, that's not good news, by the way. So, in the end, it turned out well. We floated it on the London stock market and in the end merged it with a US company called Vantiv, and it became WellPay Inc. listed in the US. So just a tremendous journey, and we created what was at the time, the #1 market player in payments as defined back then. The bit that was particularly notable to me was we created from nothing a company of real value, and I don't mean financially, yes, but more its place in the world was very significant, and I think it made me a much better CEO because I did the private thing and then the IPO and then run a public company both in the UK and the US. So I had the luxury of experiencing all these different things over the sort of 5-6 years that I was there. I think I learned so much about how to lead in different ways in different circumstances with different people. I think that's where I really understood that the most. We went on this journey to Thailand. I don't know, it cost at least a couple of £1 million for the top 100 people to go to Thailand, which sounds like a holiday. It was not a holiday. The beauty of that was it took all 100 people completely out of their comfort zone No one knew where they were going. You had a load of senior execs with their gold cards, all stuff, expecting they'd know where it was. The whole thing was managed by an expert who did nothing else but this. So you were just given a date, keep the diary free from this date to that date, and it was 6-7 days. And you were told to turn up at an airport, and that's it. And it's very disconcerting for people who are used to running big companies, and you did not know what's happening. You didn't know where you would end up. So no one flew direct to Thailand. Everyone had deliberately a connecting flight, and they were met at the first destination with a boarding pass for the eventual thing in Thailand. And they all arrived, and I hosted it as the leader, obviously. And we started in Bangkok, and then we took 50 tuk-tuks to the train station, then took the train south overnight. And the whole journey was amazing. What it really did was it's designed to make people feel very uncomfortable and very uncertain and start to question the very basics of life and what we're all here for and what our purpose is and what role did play in your life. Because we've all had success. We have knocked this one out of the park. Yes, we have the equivalent, won the World Cup, whatever you want to say, the Ashes, we've done that. I'm not finished. How do you kick on and maintain it and keep going at the next day? And so it was superb. And I think university, there's the odd people who found it. I mean, a few out of the 100, probably 2 or 3 hated it. It was too difficult. It was physically demanding. It was a bit uncomfortable. To me, that was a cost worth paying, because for the other 97 odd, they loved it, and it changed people's lives, including me. It made me understand more about my place in the world, why I'd had certain things happen to me, and some of the things we've talked about so far, the importance of people, but also just perspective, just on what's really, really important, and how to make the most of the remaining part of one's life. Taking the time to have 5-6 days out from doing any work and only thinking about how you approach life, what you do with your time, how you spend your time, which people you're working with. I mean, just the fundamental questions of life was spectacular.
In sports, Strauss, I know you've got stories about this, those kind of experience where there's almost a stripping back. You know, okay, you've had this success, but now let's forget that for a minute. Let's get back to, who am I? Who are you? Who's my teammate? What am I all about? What are you all about? And also, why are we here? They sound like such simple questions, but we kind of gloss over those quite often into kind of, okay, so how are we going to do this? How are we going to win?
The hardest thing in sport is winning after winning. It's number one in the world. It's like, how do you go again? And this is the point you were making there. I've climbed Everest. I've done what I've wanted to do. I've won the Ashes or whatever. And you can't fake that either. So if you are satisfied, you're potentially a problem for the team. And so having that opportunity just to take a step back and go, where am I right now? You know, what do I value in life? What's important to me? And what am I not willing to prioritize? And funny enough, that was the sort of decision matrix that I went through when I decided to retire from cricket, because I realized actually, having got to number one in the world, having won the Ashes, played 100 test matches, whatever, ticked off everything I wanted to achieve, and the team needed to go again. And I wasn't the person to lead it because I didn't have that drive anymore. And so just being open and honest enough with yourself is a crucial element in all of this.
And it sounds a bit trite or a bit soft or a bit weak, whatever people, I think some people listening and will think, oh, really? But those fundamental questions really matter. And at some stage you will, in my view, will be forced to answer them.
Okay, let's get to your final turning point, which is the big one. Well, one of the biggest businesses in the UK and the world, BT, being CEO of that organisation.
I'm so glad I did it. I would do it again if I had my time again in exactly the same way. I'm sure I would do a few things differently, and I made a few mistakes, but it was an absolute privilege to be the leader of a company like BT. We changed our ambition and our purpose. The purpose became quite simple, actually, and it really was, we connect for good. That's it. And if you just think about that for a minute and let it just dwell on the words, it's not just the physical connection of wires and cables and mobiles, but it's also about people and service. There are few companies that have such an important role in society that genuinely is a business with a social purpose too. People listening in won't be aware of how important BT is to the operating of the country in the background, dealing with cybersecurity issues every single day, preventing, thousands, tens of thousands every day, by the way, of potential attacks, working with the National Cybersecurity Centre and various others, but working with the public sector, the NHS, the MOD, the police force, everywhere. So it's one of these special companies. Being the leader, 130,000 people was, a huge responsibility, which I loved. And I would say, it's a turning point for me because I've known the company and I know the industry for many years. And, BT had a tough time for some of the reasons I said before. So, being able to change a bit of the plan and find a way of investing heavily in digital infrastructure, which is really what I was keen to do, and be willing to live with the consequences. We end up deciding as a company, as a board, to rebuild the whole of the digital infrastructure in the UK. With new technology coming around, AI and everything else, everything's going to be connected, needs to be connected, and you're going to need just better quality digital infrastructure. That's a £15 billion investment and involved suspending the dividend. It's the first time in the company's history, which is very painful for shareholders, which I understood and felt their pain, understand that. But it was the right thing for the company. And so the company today has much brighter prospects than it would have done if we hadn't. And the country will have the best digital infrastructure it possibly could because of those decisions. And so they weren't easy to do, but I feel really good about those.
And I suppose would have been difficult at the time, knowing that the investment process you had to go through, you probably weren't going to reap the benefits or see the benefits of that until after your tenure had come to an end, right?
Yes, 100%. And I always knew that. And actually, it's interesting. My wife always jokes about, you always seem to do that. You sort of leave when there's still, there's all the good news is about to come. But I felt like I had done what I'd come to do. The copper lines that have been taken out, they've been there for more than 100 years. So this one could last, certainly last 30, 40, 50, who knows whether it'd be longer than that. So, for the shareholders and for the returns, it's 15 years before it's cash flow positive. It's a very long time. So that's why it wasn't done before. I look back and I think the board, we never flinched, actually. The courage and conviction the whole board had behind the plan to do that was, very notable. So I enjoyed doing it. And I look back with the fondest of memories, and I wish the current management team all the very best as they continue to wrestle with a very competitive market. But it's certainly, the company has much brighter prospects now than it would have done if I hadn't been there and we hadn't done that. And I love that. Hopefully the people who are still there that work for BT feel positive about its future, and so its customers.
An amazing story, and quite hard to get your head around just some of the decision-making process and whatever, and the difficulties that go alongside doing something as ambitious as that. Look, we have run out of time, which is frustrating because I could have spoken to you all day. There have been some extraordinary nuggets. So I'm actually looking forward to listening back at this and sort of unearthing some of those nuggets that sort of passed me by as we were talking. But the way we finish this, Phil, is just by asking if there's one lesson from everything you've described so far that you want our listeners to take away from this podcast. What would it be? I know that's not an easy question to ask, but is there one thing that you want people to leave with?
The first thing that comes into my head, given everything we've described, is, be yourself. Everyone's different, and don't try and be somebody else, because there are loads of ways to be successful. And I've always believed in find something you love doing, that you're passionate about and that you're good at, and then just be yourself. And if you're like that, life will be as stress-free as it can be, and you're more likely get a lot of satisfaction out of life.
Phil, thanks so much for coming on the MindFit podcast.
Absolute pleasure. Good to see you both.